Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about upgrades to do to a carry gun. What upgrade should you do? So you buy your first carry gun, and what ends up happening is that you'll go to the forums and you'll have people telling you, well, you need this item or you need that, or you shouldn't do anything, you should spend your money on training, all this different advice on there. So let's kind of dive into this and figure out what is actually worthwhile doing, what's not, and what matters for a self-defense situation versus something like a competition, right? Where it's not really quite as detrimental if you lose, okay? So let's dive into this and see what upgrades we should or should not do to our firearm. Okay, so as a general rule, I don't want to make many changes to a defensive use carry gun, right? A defensive use firearm. Now, all of my guns are for defensive use. I use them in competition to keep my skills sharp and to do that, but I'm not a competitor by that sense of the word, right? I don't shoot USPSA and race gun categories and stuff like that are guns that nobody can actually use defensively. I shoot guns that I use in a defensive format, which is why I shoot IDPA exclusively, and I focus on that aspect of it, which means all my guns are for fighting at the end of the day, right? They're here as a tool to defend somebody's life. So I want them to be set up appropriately for that, and then I do competition on the side, right? I'm not doing competition first and then hoping that the gun is good enough for self-defense, right? I do it the inverse method, okay? So we build the gun for self-defense and then wear it out in competition, okay? So a couple of things on that. What changes do I want to make to my gun? As a general rule on factory firearms, when we start making changes to the internals, we start having reliability problems, right? As we put more complicated pieces in there, pieces that weren't meant for that, pieces that aren't fit by a gunsmith that are quote unquote drop-in, we start seeing problems with that. This is a huge issue with the Glock guys that like to make their Gucci Glocks, and they'll go put $1,000 worth of parts in there, and then their Glocks tend to have problems, okay? We see it all the time on the range. Now, do they all have problems? No. Some of those guys really actually do know how to put together a gun. They do their research on the parts. They test each part individually before they put them in. So they'll put a new trigger in there, and they'll run 1,000 rounds through it. And then they'll put a new whatever inside their gun, a new plunger, a new something else, and they run another 1,000 rounds to it. And at that point in time, they have tested that firearm to make sure that those things function and work well together. That's the other thing that we have to consider, is that they work well together. I have a Glock 26 that I have a threaded barrel for, and I have an aftermarket recoil spring. Either one of those by themselves, the gun works flawlessly. If I put them both in there, the gun doesn't cycle, right? It doesn't want to feed into the barrel right. For some reason, it changes the speed enough that the bullets drive upwards instead of actually coming into the barrel, and it won't feed right unless I take one of those out. So kind of an interesting thing that you'll figure out when you start using the guns. So as a general rule, we want to keep our guns as stock as we can. Now, some people, you like to buy threaded barrels. Not a lot of guns just don't come with a threaded barrel option from the factory, so you don't have a lot of options but to go aftermarket there. But for the most part, I don't need a threaded barrel on a carry gun anyway, so it's kind of an irrelevant point. Now, where do I need to make upgrades for a carry gun? Well, where I need to make upgrades is first to the sights. I want to have a good quality set of night sights on my gun. Always night sights, never fiber optic or brass bead or bullseye sights or anything like that. We always want night sights on our firearm. It's not so that I can shoot when it's night out and I can't see, because I always have to make positive identification on what I'm shooting at. It's so that way when I'm in a low light situation, right, because I'm using a flashlight at night, now I'm shining this light is picking up ambient light around. Now I can actually see my sights when I'm shooting. That's what night sights are for. Night sights also have the added advantage of allowing you to see them through night vision. So as a general rule, you can see tritium through night vision, although there's a lot of nuances in there, so I'm not going to say that as an end-all be-all. But you can actually use the gun through night vision with those on there. So that is something certainly to consider if you want to rock night vision. But most people aren't going to do that, so let's call it what it is. Now, there's some inherent things with certain firearms that are just poorly designed, and there's a lot of aftermarket support for. For example, Glocks. Glocks have terrible slide releases, right? They have that little itty bitty slide release. A lot of people don't like them, and so they change them out with a larger slide release. As long as you test it and use that larger slide release, I don't have a huge problem changing those out. In fact, I like bigger slide releases too, and because I want to be able to get a full thumb on there, send that slide forward, and have a good positive purchase on that with my thumb. Now, the next thing that I really want to look at is I want to look at external things to the firearm. Is there anything external I need to do? Well, I don't want to change the weight of the slide, because when I start doing slide cuts and things like that, I change the mass of the slide, which changes the dynamics of the recoil spring in there. So I want to make sure that I'm keeping that slide as original to the factory weight as possible, unless I'm having a gunsmith or somebody in the know, right? Somebody that knows what they're doing, tune that recoil spring to actually work with the new slide, right? So you have to make sure that you're picking somebody that knows what they're doing with that, because there's some nuances that go into that, and so if you don't do that correctly, you can certainly affect the reliability of it. As a general rule, I don't lighten the slides, right? And the reason being is that the factory cuts are plenty good enough to grab hold of, right? You can see I grab hold of mine quite a bit with just those fingers there, and so it's not a big issue to actually hit that. So I don't worry that much about it. Now, older Glocks where they didn't have the serration on the front, or a lot of older firearms didn't have the serration on the front, a lot of people like to add that serration. That amount of weight is probably not detrimental, but it becomes a problem when people start wanting to do the slide lightning cuts to make their slide recoil faster and stuff like that. That's where it really becomes an issue. So as a general rule, I don't advocate for lightening the slide, but if you want to add the recoil, the serration fronts on the front of it, it's not really a big problem. Beyond that, I want to have a good solid grip, so I want good stippling on my grip. I like a very aggressive stipple. A lot of people don't like the Sig Sauer 365 stipple because they say it's too aggressive. To me, it's not aggressive enough. I would like a more aggressive stippling, but that's because I shoot a lot, so my hands are fairly callous to those stipplings, and so I want to make sure that I get a good solid purchase on there, especially when my hands are cold or wet or whatever it is, because if you come out into one of our classes and it's raining, you'll find out real quick how easy it is to slip on a handgun that doesn't have a good aggressive texture, right? That gun will feel like it's sliding around in your hand the whole class. So it's one of those things where I like a very aggressive texture. Be careful not to go too aggressive on it if it's going to be touching your skin in an appendix carry or 3 o'clock position holster, because at that point in time, it's gonna start rubbing your stomach raw. It's not gonna feel too good. So. So good aggressive texture. If you want to do the serrations on the front, again, no problem with that. Good quality sights on there. And then the last thing that I generally will do and look at with the firearm, like I said, I shouldn't say that I'll generally do, because most of my guns I actually leave factory as much as I can anyways. But I a lot of times will add a flared mag weld to the bottom of the gun, because that allows me to take this portion here, right? This is always the same speed, right? Me coming up here. But this line up here and at the base of this is where I need to get my time down as much as I can and be able to slide that magazine in there quickly. So that flared magazine weld does allow me to put that in there faster. And you'll find that this is true, because what will happen is people, when they go to a competition or defensive engagement or something like that, and all of a sudden the buzzer rings or shots are being fired, this becomes slightly panicked. And so even if you're really smooth at it always, and you always get that in there nice and quick, then all of a sudden things change and you're like looking for it and, oh shit, what am I doing? So adding that little bit of that flared mag weld certainly does help. So I'm a big fan of doing the flared mag welds in there and having that ability to slam that magazine in there and having that a little bit of extra purchase on the mag weld for it. So I like flared mag welds. I've got one ordered for this gun. The one downside of flared mag welds, you got to be careful that they're not too big, because they can get a little bit cumbersome and uncomfortable for you to carry and wear, especially if you're wearing an appendix position, because they can kind of bulge a little bit there. So don't go too crazy on it. Don't feel like you can't sand them down a little bit if they are a little bit too big, though. A lot of guys will do that. If they buy one that's a competition model one, they'll actually sand it down to make it work for a conceal and carry. That's certainly an option, so you can make some adjustments there. But keep that in mind. That's really about the only changes that I'm going to do to any of my guns. I don't put different springs in them. I don't tune triggers, especially on defensive guns, which, like I said, all my guns are defensive guns, so I'm not really tuning triggers. I do have some aftermarket polished jobs, but those are all still factory jobs that have like a Vogel trigger in there or something like that. So it's still a factory, it's just been really polished, and so it just smooths out the trigger a little bit. The only reason I have those is because I want them. So anyways, not a huge fan of changing out triggers and stuff like that. It's just not good from a legal standpoint, although I'm not going to give legal advice, but it's not good from a legal standpoint going into a court battle to have a modified gun, especially with safeties. You never, ever, under any circumstances, do we modify the safeties on a firearm. And so those are certainly some things that we need to consider going forward with this, is that some of those changes that we make can make that gun appear more deadly in court. So if we have to use it, we got to be careful about that aspect of it. I don't want it to look like, hey, I couldn't satisfy my bloodlust with a factory factory gun. I had to go out and get some ultra powerful man killer Whackmaster 3000. And so we've got to be a little bit careful about that so that it's not used against us in the event, or I should say the unlikely and hopefully never event that we have to use our gun in self-defense. Now, so that's really all I'm going to do to my firearms. Now, there is one other thing that I will tune that a lot of people are really going to disagree with me on. Certain guns, I will put a heavier firing pin spring in those striker fired guns. The reason I do that is because a heavier spring doesn't ever affect the reliability of it. It will actually because it makes the firing pin hit harder. And so I will oftentimes go up a half pound on that from the factory ones, or even a full pound depending on what the firearm is. And so let's say Glock uses a 5.5 pound firing pin spring. Aftermarket ones, you can buy ones that are 6 pound springs. Well, that spring is eventually going to wear out, so you have to replace it at some point in time anyways. I replace it with a 6 pound spring for 2 reasons. The first reason is because as it wears out, it actually still will cycle that ammo reliably, right? Because as it wears out, it's getting less and less force on there, so get actually a little bit more time out of that spring before we start developing problems with it, or before we need to change it out. But the other and the absolute biggest reason that I do it with is because with modern day reloading and the amount of factory reloads that you get a lot of really cheap primers out there, these overseas primers that have low quality tolerances in their factory manufacturing of them. And so the primer cups tend to be real thick. And so those 5 pound, 4.5 pound striker springs, they tend to not cycle some of those rounds super reliably. So I make sure, and oftentimes I will upgrade that firing pin spring to give it a little bit more strength. But again, whenever we do an upgrade that affects the mechanics of it, we only do one upgrade at a time to make sure that we have time to test that upgrade, make sure that it works, that it functions, that we don't have any issues with it. But as a general rule, I don't like to mess with the internals of the firearms. Like I said, that kind of the one exception on there is I will swap out those firing pin springs on certain firearms. Certain firearms seem to be a little bit lighter duty on the firing pin spring, and seem to have more problems with that. Not a big issue for shooting factory, hydroshocks or whatever, defensive loads, right? Good quality defensive loads. But it does become a problem during your training sessions when you're shooting reloads or NATO rounds or bulk ammunition, whatever it is. It becomes a little bit more of an issue. So keep that in mind. But as a general rule, those are about the only things I really want to look at changing on a factory firearm. Realize this factory firearm functions flawlessly as it needs to from the factory. So there is no reason to do that. Unless I absolutely have to, or I have done my research. I know that will give me some advantages. So there's no hard and fast rule for this, but those are really the only considerations I want to give to a defensive use firearm. Guys, I really appreciate y'all watching. Make sure and like and subscribe to the channel if you have not already done so, and we'll catch y'all in the next one.